I ngā mana, I ngā reo, e tēnei whaitua ātāhua, mihi mai, kauranga mai. E kui mā, e koro mā, e rangatahi mā, tēnā koutou katoa. He pai ki te kōrero ki a koutou I tēnei rā. It is good to speak to you today and thank you for your warm welcome. The topic I've been asked to speak about is neurodisability in New Zealand. And my subtitle, I guess, is Seeing Through a Glass Dimly. I guess the subtext of my message is that I think history will judge us pretty harshly in 40 to 50 years' time. And from the role that I was involved in the Youth Court of New Zealand, we have probably unwittingly criminalised a whole cohort of young boys in particular, whose real issue has been neurodisability and intellectual disability that we never, ever diagnosed, identified or helped with, and our response was to group them together in concrete institutions as a punishment. So with that understatement to begin with, I've done my due diligence in understanding about acid, but I must say I was slightly concerned when I Googled and found out that I might be speaking to the Australasian Society of Infectious Diseases. But I was more reassured when I realised I could be speaking to the American Society of Interior Decorators. But I'm looking around and thinking that I am in the right places. I know some of the faces. And I should say I don't speak as an expert in any way in the field of neurodisability. I feel somewhat of a fraud even being on the stage. But what I want to do is, I guess, ask questions, and I hope provoke discussion, and I hope what we do is interactive. I wanted to start really by talking about this t-shirt that I'm about to put on. Just ask you if you know where it came from, because it, in a sense, it opens the way to talking about our vision for what we're doing. And this is the t-shirt. Do you know when and where this incident that's reflected was taking place? Any ideas? We'll make it interactive.
It's Martin Luther King.
Yeah, it's Martin Luther King. Where? Washington, DC. Do you know when? 1963. Yeah, it was. You're the first group that's got that exactly right. August 1963, and it was the famous March on Washington against the lack of real civil rights. And Martin Luther King was the last speaker. He had a prepared speech all about the concept of the Bank of America, the Bank of Justice in America, delivering a dud check to the black people of the states in terms of their rights. Actually, a few weeks ago, I was speaking to a group of children and young people, and at this stage, they started to look a bit glazed. And I said, you know what I mean by a check, don't you? And they shook their heads and said no. And I said, well, you know, you write on a piece of paper the numbers that you're going to give and sign it. They had no idea. I'm actually quite confident when I look around this room, you will know what I mean by a check. And he was 8 paragraphs into his speech, and he was talking about a promissory note that was guaranteeing justice for black people of the states was not honoured. And you can see the speech if you look at it. 8 paragraphs in, he obviously felt he wasn't connecting with the audience. And there's a pause, and one of his key advisors, Mahalia Jackson, who's a black gospel singer, called out to Martin, tell him about the dream, Martin, tell him about the dream. And she was referring to a speech he gave 2 months earlier in Detroit that never really, although was recorded and reported on, captured anybody's imagination. And it's all told in a very interesting book about the speech. And you can see Martin Luther King take his prepared notes and put them to one side, and in that pause, he then embarked on that speech that we know so well regarding black and white children in the States sitting down together in the sweltering heat of the plains of Mississippi and the injustice that they have endured. And I guess the point of that story, just by way of introduction, is to say that all of us need a vision. And my question is, what is our vision for the children that we work with who experience significant neurodisability and intellectual disability? Now, I'm assuming, I'm not an expert here, that you would see neurodisability as a subset of wider intellectual disability, or maybe two intersecting sets. Actually, the one thing I couldn't find on your very full website was anywhere a definition of intellectual disability, which is just a small point, and maybe it's a hard concept to define. But for the layperson, it was very hard to understand what it was you were focusing on. But I'm using the term neurodisability. Is it right to say neurodisability would be a subset of wider intellectual disability, or would there be an intersection? All right, let's work on that basis, intersection. The question is, what is our vision for those children and young people? And I hope that's something that we can unpack today. There's room for interruption, and I hope there can be debate to and fro with some of the questions that I ask. And if you disagree, please let me know. There's no contempt of court today. But interruptions are welcome. So what I want to talk about today, we've made some introductory comments, the need for a vision for those with neurodevelopmental issues. And I want to talk about some particular challenges. I've just got a list of them from my point of view. Then I want to back a little bit, just talk about an overview of New Zealand children generally to put what we've talked about in context. And I want to just challenge you a little bit about the issue of hearing from children and the design of our services and the way we deliver our services. Are we building in hearing from children and young people, which will be a particular challenge given the cohort that we are dealing with. But nevertheless, the principle remains the same. How are we guaranteeing that we are hearing children's views and young people's views in the way that our services are delivered? I think there's a real challenge in Australia and New Zealand for how our services are delivered for our Indigenous children in particular. I mean, it's an issue across the board in every area, but here as well. And I'd like to ask a question: is child poverty linked with some of these issues or not? And I'd love to get some feedback on that and help, because I'm often asked in the media, is there a cause or effect or even an association between material disadvantage, economic disadvantage, socioeconomic disadvantage, and neurodisability in particular? And then some concluding comments. So that's where we're headed. Another t-shirt. Some of you have seen this but haven't heard the whole story. I was in the youth court and a boy walked in and somewhat ostentatiously threw off his hoodie to reveal this t-shirt. And you see lots of t-shirts in the youth court, but this was a particular challenge for a youth court judge who was starting off that morning and keen to engage with this young boy. And I wasn't exactly certain what to say, but I knew that we have a statutory obligation to engage with young people, to encourage participation. So I said somewhat lamely, "That's an interesting t-shirt." And he said, "All good, boss." So I pressed on and said, "Well, it's a bit early to call yourself a criminal. I mean, you haven't even been to the youth court before, you haven't even answered the charge. We're getting way ahead of ourselves." this stage, his young lawyer was on his feet waving, clearly wanting me to shut up and move on. But I pressed on and said, well, I can't fault your theology, but you won't know what theology means. He said, yeah, I do. It's about God stuff. I said, yes. And I said, as a committed Christian myself, I firmly believe on the other side of heaven there will be perfect youth justice. But I said, today, the bad news is, in the Manukau Youth Court, you're stuck with me, Judge Becroft. And without being at all disrespectful, he just smiled and said, well, I hope you get it right. And I think that is a challenge for all of us. And I think so often in the youth court, when I look back on it, collaborative as we were, working with a group of joined up health and educational, justice, social work professionals and experts, I don't think we did get it right. I think we missed a lot of what was right under our nose, but we couldn't see it. We did see through a glass dimly. So I think one of the big challenges I leave with you today is, are we getting it right? When you get on the plane back to Australia, how many are from Australia here, by the way, just out of interest? Oh, there's a smattering. When you get back on the plane to Australia or other parts of New Zealand, the question that I hope resonates in our ears is, are we getting it right? So, in that context, actually those words come from Tupac, if you want to know. I never realised that. A young English teacher said that's where they come from. The words are so confronting that I couldn't even get it through the MSD government firewall to send to my computer to keep the words. But they are the words that he's talking about. And you know, too many of our young people, including those with neurodisabilities, that's their anthem. And our work's not going to be done until no New Zealand child can sing that song. So, another way of saying what I just said by way of introduction is to say that. I think too often we barked up the wrong tree. And if there was one slide that I left you with and there was no other, and you probably know it, the slide I'm about to show you, I think, was one of the most profoundly influential to our thinking that I had seen. It's actually from the work of the Children's Commissioner in England and Wales. And you probably have seen it, but I'll put it up and just work through it. Left-hand side is 8 neurodevelopmental issues. They seem to be the main ones that are mentioned in the literature and now mentioned in the new DSM-5, is it? That has a separate category of developmental disorders. Now, there may be others who say, should there be others on the list that aren't there or not? In terms of neurodevelopmental disorder, probably dyslexia and learning disabilities are in the same group, but they've been separated out here. Communication disorders, attention deficit, hyperactive disorder, autism spectrum disorder, traumatic brain injury, epilepsy, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. That's a list. In the middle column is the reported prevalence rates amongst young people in the general population in England. What's interesting in that middle column, figures? Any thoughts?
Pretty low.
Pardon?
Quite low prevalence.
In what areas?
Autism spectrum.
0.6 to 1.2?
Fetal alcohol syndrome.
0.1 to 5%? Yeah.
I can't get over the number of kids with traumatic.
Yeah, traumatic brain injury. That is something that I think challenges all of us in terms of accidental injury in homes, schools, car accidents. I mean, I fractured my own skull 4 years ago, fell down our front brick steps picking up the paper with my shoelaces undone, I think, but don't remember about a minute of it. So I know something about the effect of that. And I read there was this famous case in West Auckland of a dairy owner who was robbed and then tragically killed by 2 boys, 13 and 14. One of whom, the 13-year-old, had been in a very serious car accident about 6 years ago. The other had fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Thankfully, both were diagnosed, but the serious car accident, he went to school the next day and he talked about his head being absolutely agonisingly ringing. And he felt sick for months and just couldn't concentrate and still couldn't. So he'd had a very serious traumatic brain injury, and I think in New Zealand we miss an awful lot of that. What really stopped me in my tracks was the prevalence rate reported amongst young people in custody. And that's why I think what I said at the start, while a generalisation isn't such a crude overstatement as you might think.
And that's not counting the compounding effects of abuse.
That's not counting the compounding effects of abuse and socioeconomic disadvantage. And I was in, for instance, Perth a few weeks ago at the Australian Conference of Children's Commissioners, and in terms of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which is referred to in Australia as FASD, which isn't a way we describe it here, is it? But that's how it's described there. The big youth justice residence in Perth for Western Australia, Banksia Hill, which has about 150 at any one time inmates, and it's had some controversy as to whether it's properly humane. The recent study there for FASD, which needed both a number of confirmed symptoms plus a mother's confirmation of drinking during pregnancy, the study there with those with a mother's confirmation of drinking demonstrated that 38% of the boys in Banksia Hill had fetal alcohol spectrum diagnosis. But the but is important. The researchers thought it was likely to be double because most mothers didn't want to confirm drinking during pregnancy, and that's what was required for confirmation. So why I'd drop everything to come here today from my previous role as 16 years in the youth court, everything that we saw at the time and I read subsequently points to the fact that undiagnosed neurodevelopmental disabilities was a key factor in all that we were doing. And we are waking up to it in New Zealand, but waking up to it quite late. We've got a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder plan, 2016 to 2021, I think it is. To be honest, it's high on plan, but very low on action. And I think, are there people from the Ministry of Health here? It would be good to question why some of the recommendations there simply aren't being progressed. And I got a note from a paediatrician in Dunedin who said with our current staff, we can cope with 6 children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, but we think in the region as a whole, right through to age 20, there are 6,000. And a letter I received recently said of our 60,000 births in New Zealand each year, up to 2,000 are likely to have some form of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder based on international prevalence rates, which is a massive public health issue. And the point they made, it's a significantly greater issue than many other areas that we campaign publicly with vast amounts of money and effort. And yet it seems clear that for education, for criminal justice in particular, we have an issue that is of vast proportions in terms of spending the taxpayer dollar that is largely left publicly unaddressed. I mean, there's been a campaign, I hadn't realised behind the scenes, to label every alcohol bottle and tin with an absolutely clear warning that consumption of alcohol by a woman who's pregnant or trying to get pregnant will cause permanent, irreversible brain damage. But there's been no action on it. So what I can't quite understand is that's just one area of neurodisability. But for some reason, now from my perspective as Children's Commissioner, I think we've stalled. There's been a lot of talk, a lot of planning, but insufficient action. Can I give you 2 stories to try and make what we've talked about more human? I can vividly remember the story of a boy who was sentenced to 6 months in a youth prison. We call it a youth justice residence, but it's effectively a prison, for some serious burglaries over and over again. And he actually did quite well in the residence. The residence had a structured day, and there was a clear program set out every day, and the army were involved in an outdoor life skills program, which again was very structured, and he did superbly well. He was one of the stars of the course. And it was a good cognitive behavioural therapy component that got people talking and him thinking with all the others, it was said, about how to stop before being asked to commit a burglary. The day he was released back to his home, his friends came around and said, "We're doing a burg, we're doing a mission tonight, will you come?" He said, "Yep," straight away. He was into it. I pushed him through the front window. There were 2 very serious burglaries that he committed. And everybody working with him was devastated. After all, he'd been through the program, had a great cognitive behavioural therapy. No one could understand it. And a judge who had just come back from Canada on a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder conference suddenly twigged. And so I wonder if that is the issue. Now, this was about 2008. It took a huge amount of time to find people in New Zealand who were capable of providing the diagnosis. And it cost about $1,800, which the court paid for. But the result that came back was that he was significantly affected by fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And no one had seen it. And you know, the thousands of dollars that had been poured into the cognitive behavioural therapy was said to be a complete and utter waste of time. What he needed was a structured day that he got in the residence, constant monitoring, supervision, and a clear plan day by day for his life ahead. And I saw what they did. They provided it all laminated on a sheet on the fridge for him. He didn't go back to the residence. He got good help in the community. And with that 24/7 plan for his daily life, everything changed. He coped fine. He did well in the community. That's just one story that we knew about. But I suspect that could be replicated many, many times. Just a few weeks ago, I was in South Auckland, where there is a very good program in Altara called My Story, bringing young people together where they can safely talk about their own life issues and stories. I got his permission. I just want to read you his story. The names I've just changed, obviously. My name is Hemi. I'm 16 years old. I'm one of 10 siblings, 5 brothers and 4 sisters. My story begins in a part of New Zealand where I was born. My parents had struggled in their relationship to raise me, and my mum turned to alcohol and drugs early in her life. Sadly, this affected me while she carried me in her womb. I have just been diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome at 16. I've discovered what this is. I have delayed development and problems in thinking, speech, movement, and social skills. Because of the inability of my parents to be able to care for me, I have been in and out of child and youth family services all my life. 14 homes to be exact, which isn't a record because I met a girl in Christchurch recently that had 62 placements. And she too had real issues with dyslexia and mild autism. I have been exposed to violence and verbal abuse, ridiculed, teased, and made a fool of by my peers and caregivers throughout my upbringing. I've never felt I belonged anywhere because I have seen good and bad people come and go all my life. I just want to be part of a normal family. I miss my mum, but I feel that she has abandoned me and she has made it clear that she has no time for me. But Dad tries to connect our relationships. I'm still hopeful. At the age of 14, my dad finally was approved to have me, and I've been living with him, my stepmum, granddad, aunt and uncle ever since. When I started college, I got into some trouble there, where I became frustrated, angry, and another boy and I started to push each other, and I was knocked unconscious and taken to hospital. School was concerned about my safety, and the then Child, Youth and Family Services have been involved to try and support me with my learning difficulties, and thought a mentor would help me teach some social skills. I've been enjoying the mentoring. I'm learning about emotional regulation. My day is well planned. I now understand how I feel inside and what behaviours others see. I'm learning better communication skills and how to problem solve, being able to identify problems and find different possible solutions. I feel good and better about myself in the last few months. I've learned how to play basketball, and it's helped me a lot with my confidence. I've done things I thought I would never been able to do. I've got my learner's license, completed a mechanics course, and been going to church. My relationship with my dad and stepmum is so much better. I love my mentoring program and my planned days. My goals are to repair my relationship with my mum and to become an auto mechanic, as well as to become a professional drift car driver, slightly more concerning. That boy had been right through primary school and early secondary school, been in and out of 14 homes with child, youth and family support. But again, his underlying issue, his neurodevelopmental issues, had never been identified. So in that context, I really wanted to raise some challenges this morning. And they start by, I guess, me repeating this poem or phrase that you've probably heard of. The cognitively challenged are before our courts in unknown numbers. Boy, is that true in New Zealand. We prosecute them again and again. We sentence them again and again. We imprison them again and again and again. And that boy I talked about with his burglary, he would have gone there again, but for one judge who just did some real intervention to find out what the real problem is. They commit crimes again and again and again. We wonder why they do not change. The wonder of it all is that we do not change our expectations rather than trying to change them. I mean, that's a challenge for our whole criminal justice system. I just speak as someone who's left that field now. I know the new Principal Youth Court Judge John Walker, is absolutely committed to better understanding neurodisability. It's probably one of the big issues, I think, facing our criminal justice system. It has some enormous implication in terms of being responsible for one's actions. Now, I think things could change in 40 or 50 years' time. People will come with brain scans and gene maps and maps of brain functioning that will entirely change the way the criminal justice system deals with the people before it. This is an interesting quote too. Is a criminal justice system that commits young people with neurodisability to custody a fair system if those young people do not understand the consequences of their actions and their disability and needs are not identified, recognised and responding to, such that interventions and sentences serve to criminalise rather than to offer support? It's a pretty bold and stark and bald challenge, isn't it? We're getting much better, it seems to me, but we've got a long way to go. So, some particular challenges. How many here are researchers? Hands right up. It would just be great to see more research being carried out, and in particular to improve our diagnosis. That's what I don't understand. We have tried for ages in New Zealand to say, could we have a New Zealand-based prevalence study? And what I'm told is, well, we probably miss FASD, but we pick it up indirectly because of comorbidity. Other neurodevelopmental issues probably are occurring, such as ADHD or dyslexia, so we're providing help anyway, which I don't think is very satisfactory, because the more we know about the different neurodisabilities, different approaches are required. But to my knowledge, does any researcher know differently, there is no New Zealand prevalence study. Well, I think that's a big challenge for this group. Can you campaign for, can you push as hard as you can for and carry out a prevalence study? We even arranged for the 4 youth justice prisons, youth justice residences, where there's about 120 boys to be, ethical approval was in principle gained for them all to be, each boy, each girl there, to have a study done on them regarding neurodisability, including FASD. But there wasn't the funding or the interest for it, and it never happened. So that, I think, is an enormous challenge, and for a group such as ACID, those 3 starting points, I think, are really important. And they're more in terms of the research. But I don't think New Zealand has really got the message. Good research, New Zealand-based research, would help get that message out and provide the platform for it. And it seems to me there are very few, even given a diagnosis, very few pathways for support available for children with neurodisability issues. And what we find a lot of the, say, 700 calls we get to our office as Children's Commissioner, probably a third of them relate to educational concerns, and most of them are to do with neurodisability. What we're told is they go to CAMS, the Community Adolescent Mental Health Service, who say after several visits, it's behavioural.
Then who does that?
Yeah.
Orangatamari.
Keep asking, yeah. That's exactly what we get told. It's behavioural. And we'd really like to help, and help's required, but we can't because our specifications exclude you. So when that's all explained about a month, they then say, where do you go next? They say, well, you might go to Child, Youth and Family Services, or Rangatamariki, who haven't, but will from 1 July next year at least have an obligation to involve themselves where support and assistance is required, if it means there's a current risk of being removed, so the bar's lowered. And then if they can't do it because they say it's not quite bad enough yet and you've got a loving, stable family, where then, can I ask you, where do you go? Where does a young mother who I met in South Auckland with a boy aged 5 that she was desperately concerned about, who went to CAMS, who after a month in the end said, we can't take your boy into our service, where do they go? Because I need to know. Can you tell me here if this is interactive? Where? But what's the needs assessment? I mean, how do they access it? Where is it in the phone book?
Would they not get a referral to a paediatrician?
Pardon?
Would they not get a referral to a paediatrician?
Yeah, I'd hope that they would. How many paediatricians here?
Yeah.
Ah.
And I can comment that
Can you all hear this, by the way, or not?
We have a roving mic.
We've got a roving mic. We'll make this interactive, because I'm just raising the questions. Hang on.
sorry, I'm a paediatrician in South Auckland, just a developmental paediatrician.
Right. You might need to put your microphone right up close. Yes.
I'm a developmental paediatrician in South Auckland, so see these kids all the time. There's a real there's a huge hole, because you were talking about neurodisability. Disability in this country does not include, disability funding does not include the majority of children that and young people that you've talked about on your, in your list. Yep.
Right.
Includes intellectual disability, and I'm not picking on the Ministry of Health people in the room here, but there's a real...
I don't think there are Ministry of Health people here either in the room. Well, you can then, that's fine. We would if they were here, respectfully, anyway, because I need to be challenged.
Disability for developmental services, for disability services, has a clear definition in New Zealand, and it excludes most children with FASD. The children and young people with traumatic brain injury go under ACC and get lost in some sort of different...
So you're saying that the definition of intellectual disability
is defined in this country in a certain way.
excludes...
It excludes... it's a DSM diagnosis, but disability itself is not just intellectual disability. It's children with FASD, the majority of who actually don't have a formal ID diagnosis. And yet the funding, so there's no funding in the disability sector for those children. Now everyone pick up, because you all come from different regions, but there's real issues. The diagnosis itself, I'm funded out of what's called personal health, so that it's the same funding you get for a urinary tract, seeing a child with a urinary tract infection. So I know, me and myself and my team, which includes psychologists, it will take us probably up to 20 hours to do a good diagnostic assessment of a young person with complex neurodevelopmental problems, including FASD, and there isn't that sort of funding. And I'm not saying that's the only answer, because you still have to put in all the support services thereafter, but there's some really siloed approaches to disability in this country.
So would you get referrals from CAMS?
We work with CAMS both ways, but it tends to be, we also silo ourselves because the need is so great. We just cannot deal with the current number of referrals.
How do you prioritise them then?
We sit down and try and work it out.
Are there community groups that can assist, or are there other?
There's very few diagnostic services.
Yes.
Yeah.
So without the diagnosis, it's very hard to move forward, isn't it?
Yeah, there are. I know counties in the funding and planning is actually approaching it differently. They've decided that the diagnosis it's actually to go. They're actually going back to the preventative and putting all their effort into the preventative sector. And I'm not saying that's necessarily the wrong thing. So working with young mums and trying to do it that way. It's a wicked problem, as the former commissioner talked about.
Well, that's very reassuring in one sense to hear I'm asking questions that are not easily answered.
I will respond. I came from the Ministry.
Oh, good, right. Thank you for the opportunity. So I didn't see your hand up.
No, I was sitting in the corner.
Oh, right.
Two of us here today.
Who else are here from the Ministry of Health? That's good to know, because that's, I mean, what we've interested to know about the FASD plan too.
Right, yeah, and the siloed approach is difficult, and that is an area of focus. So for disability support services,
Can you put the,
one part of the
Yep.
Ministry of Health, we would expect that the 5-year-old that you're talking about would be able to get support services through the NASC. So what's their phone number? We have an 0800 number. It's the Local Needs Assessment Service Coordination Organisation, and they would be getting support and an assessment through a developmental delay diagnosis, not necessarily FASD. And over time, we're sorting out how we will put support services in for people with FASD, and it's not an easy area.
no.
Absolutely agree. But for that 5-year-old and that 5-year-old's mother, we would expect support services to be put in, including things like respite, including things like parenting programs, the links with education, so stepping stones or explore. There are services available.
Well, that is encouraging to know, and it's good to get that message out, because until you'd mentioned, I didn't know there was that number.
Yeah, 0800, what is it? 0800 Max. Someone will know. It is on the Ministry of Health website, and it is quite easy to Google if you, there's a number for all the NABs throughout the country.
Well, I came here to ask questions and provoke, so thank you, Mum, for being courageous enough to stand up. And now there's 2 more hands up here. Thank you for that, because it'll be good to talk more.
Thank you. Trish Brown, excuse my gravely voice. It's interesting that we're seeing this as a health problem when I see this as a social development, education, humanity issue. It's interesting that the current resourcing framework for education is not based on any prevalence data. There's nothing to suggest that the prevalence data that comes out of the UK, Scotland, Canada, the US would be any different here. We know that kids don't get what they need in schools, and schools don't get what they need to respond to kids with different challenges. So when we get large numbers disengaging from the education system and ending up in the youth court, that's a problem. So I think we look to specialist solutions, but actually if we invested in a system where teachers had their capacity increased to notice and respond and refer where necessary, we make these kids bad, sad and so different, then actually they belong in the population of all children. who have rights that should be recognised and responded to, instead of seeing them as problems that need fixing. So all schools should have the resources to respond to all children. The current high-level changes going on in education are about a new effort to have a quality education system, and guess what? The kids with learning support needs are being dealt with to the side. A quality education system is an inclusive education system. Sorry to take the...
No, it's very good to get the interaction.
Oh, I was just going to make the point that the response from the ministry about, funding on the grounds of developmental delay, I understand that. But if you have any of the developmental disorders and do not have an intellectual disability, then you've got real problems. And I'm sure that there are a number of other psychologists like me who are asked, would you please assess this person and find an intellectual disability, please, because then we can get funding.
Yeah, which seems a bit screwy, doesn't it? We could talk a lot more. I'm glad that we've made this interactive. Where there is no prevalence study, it's very hard to work out resource need. One thing I've thought about too, as we've discussed, is that the before school checks, or the well child tamariki ora checks in New Zealand, which are 8 or 9 stage developmental checks right up to preschool, just before school, I'd like to think that could be widened and deepened to examine as much of those issues that can be found before 5 as possible. I think there's a real opportunity there to find out more. Anyway, they are the questions that I raised. Is there an answer to that question, by the way? Does anyone know the answer? Whether there's a relationship?
Eric Emerson's work will point to issues around poverty and intellectual disability in the UK.
Right, Eric Emerson.
I'll write it down. Yeah, and Australia, I think, too.
Yeah.
And thank you too for the Ministry of Health. I'm so glad you did identify yourself, because it's important that we talk about this together. This can't be about blame, because I'm standing here saying I was the one who presided over a youth court for 16 years that probably missed, or certainly missed, a whole group of young boys, and we used the wrong approach. What we have to do is to say, with our new vision, how are we going to do it better? It seems to me it must start with the New Zealand prevalence study. Then we know the extent of the problem we're dealing with. Then it may be easier to get resources and to change definitions to do so. I could go on, I thought my problem would be that I wouldn't have enough to say in an hour as somebody who's just learning and has experienced it as a part of the system. So there's a lot that I won't cover. I covered some of those issues at the start, but what I want to conclude with, apart from saying, how many children are there in New Zealand? When we put this in context, how many children overall? And I agree with you, Trish, the rights that you're talking about are owed to all children. How many children, using the definition 18 and under, or under 18, how many under 18-year-olds are there in New Zealand? 11,000, 500,000, or here more than 500,000? 2 million? Well, this is great. 500,000, 800,000, 2 million. That's the answer. It's actually a dropping percentage because of the ageing population. And if people often ask me how well are our children doing, 70% in New Zealand do really well. We can celebrate that. Some world-leadingly well. There is a but, 20% really struggle. And many of the group that we're talking about today are in that group. And 10% do as badly and probably worse than any Western world counterpart. So New Zealand is a country quite unlike what it was 50 years ago, with a significant disparity, significant disadvantage, significant gaps between what you might say, I guess, the haves and the have-nots. This is not the New Zealand I grew up in. And we know disadvantage and dislocation and marginalisation as we never knew in the 60s and 70s. And too many of our children are being left behind in this area and in others. But what I wanted to challenge you about, and let's leave some of the demographics behind, was this issue to conclude with. in all our discussions that we're having today, how well do we involve children in our research and in our service delivery and in our practice framework? How often do we hear, I mean children as in under 18, how often do we hear from young people? How often do we seek them out? Minister Tolley, in reconstituting Child, Youth and Family to become Oranga Tamariki, had an advisory group of care-experienced children. You know what the first thing they said to her was? When you remove us, don't separate us from our brothers and sisters. But you know, there was no statutory principle of sibling unity until this year. It's just been passed through Parliament solely because of the impetus from those children. They also said, your services just end at 17th birthday. All our friends can go to university or technical study, they come back, go to their families for Christmas. We can't. Why do you just ditch us at age 17th birthday? Gone. That's why the age has gone through now to 18, 21, with an opt-in to 25, solely because of what children said about the service. This little video clip, it's Australian, unscripted, and a quite different concept. These aren't context, these aren't neuro-disabled children, but it does make the point about hearing from children and the wisdom of children.
If I was Prime Minister, I would make it illegal. What does he get $5?
That's just the ladies.
$7. Should be flat out illegal, like, I'm not joking, I'm not being unreasonable. Women and men should have the same money. They should have 50-50.
Well done.
60-60. It shouldn't be how hard you work.
If you do the same work, you should get paid the same money.
What we're trying to tell you is that it's not fair that boys get paid more than girls. Men noticed they were being paid more than the women. They should speak up about it.
When I'm old, I'm going to make a change.
Yes. Oh, I have no words, it's so wrong.
Yeah, that wee boy said, when I get older, I'm going to make a change if I don't forget. I mean, children's voices always add quality to the debate. So often we think we know what children will tell us, whether it's a throwback to our colonial past, whether we think children and young people are potential adults who will have a view, but don't have personal agency now in their own right. I'm not sure what it is. But there's nothing so dangerous as a recent convert. And in my 2 years as Children's Commissioner, I've seen time and time again the value of hearing from children. The most small example on our football club at Wellington College. We couldn't understand why the year 11, 12 and 13 boys ditched playing soccer. So we got 3 boys onto the committee and they said, we can tell you why that is, because you adults do it in an adult way. You have trials, you organise it, you rank us in hierarchies, you choose the coaches, you choose the managers, you choose the practice times. Let us choose our own teams. We want to play with ourselves and we'll all play. Went from 4 teams to 21 teams overnight. Do you have in your research and your organisations, do you have more than one young person on your committee, for instance? Do you have a reference group of children and young people who are feeding into you? There are lots of ideas. Do you have children who you can survey? We've done it very badly in New Zealand. At the bottom of it, you know, children do want us to ask them. That's a great quote, isn't it? I'm a library, quiet but filled with knowledge. It's dumb that I'm not asked. And just because the cohort we're dealing with are intellectually disabled or neurodiverse doesn't mean, nonetheless, that we shouldn't make an extra effort to think about ways that we can hear from them. That's where I want to stop, but with a T-shirt to oh. Now, can I drive this here? I'll leave this with you because there's, before the T-shirt, in my view, this is, the whole idea of engaging with young people is non-negotiable. True story. Nothing to do with neurodisability, but maybe it does indirectly.
This is Captain Hancock. You will divert your course over. Negative, Captain. I'm not moving anything. You change your course. So, this is the USS Montana, the second largest vessel in the North Atlantic Fleet. You will change course 15 degrees north. I will be forced to take measures to ensure the safety of this ship. Over. This is the lighthouse, mate.
Engaging with children ought to be non-negotiable. It ought to be non-negotiable. And it is, after all, their right. It's their right in the Convention on the Rights of the Child that we just don't take seriously enough in Australia or New Zealand. They've got a right to be heard on issues that affect them. We need to deliver that. To conclude, I want to show you a picture of a T-shirt, I couldn't get it, of a young boy who I met overseas. This is the boy here. And his name, he wanted me to take his name. His name's Kane. And he was definitely one of those in the neurodevelopmental, you would say neurodiversity field, and he'd had a pretty tough life. He was telling me all about it. And he, in a way, to me, encapsulated the challenge for us I want to conclude on, which is a micro challenge for each of us individually, but a system challenge. He was wearing his Martin Luther King T-shirt, and he turned around, because it was Martin Luther King Day, and he said, "This is my motto. If I cannot do great things, I can do small things in a great way." I hope for each of us this morning's been a challenge to think, how can we do better in the individual interactions that we have, in my case with children and young people? How can we ensure that we don't get it wrong, that we get it right, to remember that boy in the youth court? How can we in our individual practice demonstrate that we don't overlook some of the issues that we're talking about? But he also said to me, there's a quote for you, and we were queuing up for lunch, and at the lunch table, propped up against the lettuce, was this quote. He said, "This is for you." So I don't know what it means, he said, but it's for you. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. This group has enormous power and influence when I look around the group. I mean, we have to do so much better. I mean, I've tried to raise the questions. I know I've been a bit provocative. I apologise to the Ministry of Health people if I've been a bit too blunt. I'm glad to know that you're here. I'm glad we can have the debate. But I think we have a great plan, but we need more action. We desperately need a prevalence study. We definitely need, I think, better funding. We need a committed nationwide approach to children with neurodisability. It's a huge issue. We do see through a glass dimly. But I hope today we've been able to slightly, like in that TV advertisement before the news, slightly remove some of the mist that fogs our understanding. And I hope in 50 years' time, people won't look back on us as harshly as I suspect that they will. But we can make a difference, and I hope that we can do it. Thank you. Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions.
Okay, we've had lots of questions.
We have had lots of questions, and I know that there'll be many, many people who want to respond to your challenge.
There's the former Disability Rights Commissioner there.
Paul, you've got your hand
He wouldn't have a question, he'd have a speech of his own he could have given on this.
Pass the mic to Paul. It's coming from the front. Thanks.
Kia ora, thank you, Judge Becroft, for really picking up this issue. I think it's been left too long around neurodisability. And a comment, I think it should be fed into the Justice Review. It is also being fed into the Ministry, to the Mental Health Inquiry, where that's picked up there or not. A quote from a child before I go on to a question. A range of children said this about in my days as a researcher with children. They did not like labels or discourses or discussions which divided their family or blamed their family or blamed their mothers. That feedback did go into the development of the so-called legal spectrum disorder strategy, knowing the impact that label does have on birth mothers and the impact that what children are saying about labels like that. We do need to listen to the voices of children and understand how this impacts on families, just not on medical conditions. It's a rights issue. A question, and it draws on the broader neurodisability, intellectual disability area, and not just on boys, but more particularly young women, mums. We still see mums, people with intellectual disabilities, having their children taken off them for no particular reason at all. Just having a look over the Orangatanga website last night, this was highlighted yesterday at a session that talks about how they disagree with the disability sector and disagree with the idea of a social model of disabilities, and disabled mums are complex, and there's all these issues about interaction between government departments which make it too hard, and we divide families on this basis. There's a real outrage about what Trump is doing in America and dividing families, but it happens in New Zealand now, and we are looking to our advocates to pick up on this and make a difference so that we can keep families together, including where there's disabled parents and disabled children.
And that's an issue that you were very involved in, isn't it, Paul? You were involved yourself in that issue, weren't you, advocating for that strongly?
Yeah, and we're aware of many horrific cases of mothers having their children taken away now, still, and it'd be great to have some action, some comment from the Monitor of Children on this now, if we could.
Oh well, I can take that on board. Yeah, I haven't looked at the stats, and I haven't ever heard that issue raised before, you know.
I understand when it's been asked for and official information requests have been made, they say we don't keep stats on disabled children, disabled parents in this way.
If
Oh well.
you don't keep stats, you don't exist. You're not counted. Are there any other questions? Jason, if you grab the mic off Paul, I'm sure I saw some other hands up.
There's a hand there, but there's also morning tea I can smell. So, you sir, there's a man right here with a
If you raise
white
your
shirt,
hand,
open neck.
Jason will know how to get it to you somehow. Really good issue.
So I work for Explore, and we work with young people and adults who are eligible for disability support services. We provide behaviour support to them. We've been talking a bit about...
Where's Explore based?
Everywhere. We're national. We work with over 2,000 people a year, and interestingly last year had an increase in referrals, 500 extra referrals last year, all for children under the age of 10. We've been talking about expanding out the definition of disability so that we can work with more people, but I know that in Queensland what they're doing over there is they're trialling a parenting support program that's free to everyone in the state, and they're getting some really positive outcomes. So I think that's another way of tackling this issue rather than looking at diagnosis. I support trying to get diagnosis right, but why don't we make support to families free to everyone?
And right behind you, there's a hand up.
I'm from Australia, but most diagnosis seems to be part of the issue, and
got people who have needs, and why aren't we focusing on the people who have needs rather than trying to, we're struggling to get diagnosis. We've heard people say diagnosis is difficult. And I know in the education system in New South Wales, we've started to now look at, rather than you can actually get funding and support based on your need, you don't actually have to have a diagnosis. Obviously that might help to get more support, but they're even working just on need rather than this diagnosis.
Right.
Perhaps we have time for one more question, and I think morning tea is definitely on the agenda. There's a question over there, Anne. If you just wait a moment, we'll pass the mic to you.
I'm a speech language therapist, so communication is one of the things that's close to my heart. And I know that you know a colleague of mine, Sally Kedge, and the work she's been doing with Talking Trouble. Wondered whether you'd like to just make a comment about what we're trying to do as far as helping people understand what's going on when they do enter the youth justice system.
Why don't you, it's good for somebody here to talk it up.
Yeah, well, I mean, I haven't had first-hand knowledge, which you probably have, but it's really looking at young people going into the justice system and not understanding what's going on, and having the supports in place to help them understand what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, the early signs are about 60% of those in the youth court have an oral language communication or processing skill. Ironic that the whole system, which is properly based on having children's participation through a family group conference, may have overlooked that for many kids much more help than they're being given is required for them to participate in that. And it's another area I think that we've overlooked, and the study that is being undertaken is focusing exactly on prevalence and how we can do better. And much more work is being done to provide assistance and sometimes a paid for supporter. And I forget the name of it. There's a name that we, pardon? Yeah.
In Australia we use intermediaries.
That sort of thing, an intermediary in court who is with the young person, both explaining and helping convey the young person's point of view. So there are some major advances that are going on that I think are exciting. I mean, I think there's two equal and opposite dangers in all of this. We can be too negative about how bad it is, but we can be too optimistic about how good it is. And I don't think it's as bad as perhaps I've put it in the extreme way, but neither is it as good as some would like us to think. We've got an awful lot of work to do.
Thank you for that. I think we need to conclude. I'm pretty sure that if you stayed for our morning tea, which I doubt you can do, you would be inundated with further questions and comments from people. Judge Becroft, we wanted you to come to this conference because we wanted to talk about partnerships and the power that comes with that. And today I've really been reminded about the silo that has existed between the justice sector and disability sector and health sector, and the really enormous opportunity we have when we share. So on behalf of ACID and all of us present, we'd like to extend this gift with our thanks.
Thank you very much.